Hi there, welcome back. This week, we're going to talk about the qualifications for investigators and for sites. So this is really important for a research coordinator. You're not the investigator, but you can have a lot of control over the quality of your site and how your site is perceived by sponsors and potential sponsors. So let's dig in, of course, as we always do with regulations. So what is an investigator? That's the very first question, and we're going to find two different answers here. The first one in ICH E6, section 1.34, which is the glossary. An investigator is a person responsible for the conduct of the clinical trial at a trial site. If a trial is conducted by a team of individuals at a trial site, the investigator is the responsible leader of the team and may be called the principal investigator. Most of the times you'll hear people refer to PI for principal investigator. This person's the leader, right? So they're the de facto leader, and according to ICH E6, basically they are going to be the ones held, it's implied, but they're going to be the ones held responsible for the conduct of the trial. 21 CFR 312 is a little different. Whereas ICH E6 is the person responsible, the investigator in 21 CFR is the individual who actually conducts a clinical investigation, i.e., under whose immediate direction the drug is administered or dispensed to a subject. In the event an investigation is conducted by a team of individuals, which, by the way, is always the case, the investigator is the responsible leader of the team. So you can see between these two, even though we say in ICH that this is the leader, 21 CFR basically says this is a person who actually does stuff and is the responsible leader. So 21 CFR is a little more specific. And whenever I look at the differences between ICH E6 and 21 CFR 312, whatever, I always want to follow the language that is the most conservative. Because if you follow the language that's most conservative, you will by default also be compliant with the broader language. So then what is a sub-investigator, right? Because it says when it's conducted by a team, but we know it's always conducted by a team. The only time anything's ever done outside of a team setting is in that older TV show House. There was always the doctors doing everything, but we know that's not how life works. So what is a sub-investigator? ICH E6 says any individual member of the clinical trial team designated and supervised by the investigator at a trial site to perform critical trial-related procedures and or to make important trial-related decisions. So this means associates, residents, research fellows. This would not say the receptionist, for example, right? This person is not performing critical trial-related procedures and also not making important trial-related decisions. Under ICH E6, I think you can make the argument that depending on how the trial site works, that some clinical research coordinators could be considered sub-investigators under E6. But again, it's going to depend on how the job description is written and how much authority this person is given to make decisions. 312.3b says, in the event an investigation is conducted by a team of individuals, the investigator is the responsible leader of the team. We've already established that. But sub-investigator includes any other individual member of that team. And so definitely the research coordinator then, according to 312, would be considered a sub-investigator. All right, so we now know what's an investigator, what's a sub-investigator. Let's talk a little bit about the site selection criteria according to 21 CFR. 312.53a, a sponsor shall select only investigators qualified by training and experience as appropriate experts to investigate the drug. Then we already established that in the scavenger hunt and the true and false. So investigators qualified by training and experience as appropriate experts to investigate the drug. So you certainly wouldn't have an obstetrician being the investigator for an acne trial, right? So this is just sort of a lot of common sense thing here. That's all we're going to say about the investigator. So ICH E6 section 4.2 says, this is a lot more specific, and this is the criteria we're going to defer to because it's more conservative. The first thing you have to have is adequate staff. Investigators should have available an adequate number of qualified staff and adequate facilities. And you can already see now that this is a lot more specific than 21 CFR, just qualified by training and experience. So, adequate staff, and that's all it says. What is adequate staff to you? And this is going to be questions that you're going to get from sponsors who are interested in maybe considering your site. What are the minimum educational standards for each job description at your site? How many staff do you currently have working on your trials? Do your research staff have duties assigned to them outside of research? Basically, there can be a host of questions here that is trying to determine, do you have enough people to do the work? So even if you say how many staff you have working on your trials, that maybe is not detailed enough. So the sponsor might ask some more questions about that. How many trials are assigned to each research coordinator, things like that. So these are just some sample questions you'll get. Oh, there we go. How many studies are currently assigned to each coordinator? What is that division of labor like? Is the coordinator responsible for everything, including IRB, communications and relationship, or do you have a regulatory coordinator who handles all the IRB things? These are all questions that the sponsor is going to want to ask. So, do you have adequate staff? The investigator should ensure that all persons assisting with the trial are adequately informed about the protocol, the investigational products, and their trial-related duties and functions. How are new research staff trained? That's a good question. Oftentimes people end up in clinical research sort of accidentally, and they might not have any prior experience. So at the site, how are the new research staff trained? How are the experienced but new research staff trained as well? How is new study-specific information distributed to staff? So if you have a clinic, and it's an outpatient clinic where treatments are administered, when a new protocol is initiated, how are those nurses and the phlebotomists and maybe the pharmacist trained on study-specific procedures, the protocol? Other common site selection questions. How much time is typically required to receive an IRB approval? Now, you are not responsible for the IRB. The IRB will move at its own pace, but an exceptionally slow IRB will be a liability for your site, because the potential sponsors are looking at how quickly can we get IRB approval, how responsive is the IRB to needs. So they'll say, typically, how long does it take for you to get a new protocol or a new study through the IRB? How long does it take you to typically, on average, right, typically require to finalize the contract? So the contracts oftentimes will be reviewed in terms of legal. So you'll have a legal team look at the contract to make sure that there's no language in there that's not suitable, that it puts you at risk, it creates a disadvantage for you, legally speaking. And then there's always the budget concerns. Are you getting paid enough for that? So those different layers of review can take some time, and this is a really good question. And it's a very fair question, because you could have a very fast IRB that approves things very, very responsively, but if you have a legal department that's like snails, it's going to be a problem. Does your site have SOPs, right? This is sort of saying, how serious is your site about conducting consistently, reliably good research? And SOPs do that for your site. So these are, and they might even want to take a look at a few of them. When was your most recent FDA inspection? And this might predate you. The FDA doesn't show up all the time. It might have been 10 years ago. So you should be prepared to at least answer that, even if it was not on your watch, even if you were not part of the FDA inspection. You still need to know when it was, and then most importantly, what were the findings from the FDA inspection? Were there any deficiencies? And you need to know that and how they were addressed. And I will tell you, you can sort of fudge a little bit on the first question about the IRB approval. You can fudge a little bit about how long does it take to get a contract approved and finalized. And the SOPs, especially if they ask to see them, but the FDA inspection and the findings can be found with just a few minutes of internet searching. So you can't fudge on that. They will find out if you lied. If you say, yeah, we had an FDA inspection in 2008 and they didn't find anything, when in fact there were findings. It really doesn't bode well for a good working relationship with your sponsor, and they very likely won't come and do a trial with you. Some background checks, so that, like I mentioned, that you can look at the FDA stuff and figure out what's going on. Sponsors will do this as well. I mean, the internet's out there. We can all check up on each other, right? So you can look at the disqualified/totally restricted list. So the FDA has a list of everybody who is just permanently not permitted, debarred, not allowed to do research. And there's a restricted list. And you can find this out about potential employers too. So don't think this is a tool just for a sponsor. Once you leave the program and you want to work somewhere, you would like to work at a really good site, right? I mean, that just makes sense. Everybody wants to have the best employer they can find. So you could also look at these things from a potential employment perspective. NIDPO letters, and if you remember all the way back from Intro 1, NIDPO is the awesome, easy, fast acronym that means Notice of Initiation of Disqualification Proceedings and Opportunity to Explain. And now you know why we say NIDPO. So NIDPO letters are a open to the world internet FDA website where you can see exactly the letters that were sent to investigators. These are basically open Form 483s. If you remember from FDA audits, Form 483 is when the FDA finds a deficiency, there's an opportunity to explain. So NIDPO letters, now I will remind you, when the FDA does submit a Form 483 and they find a deficiency at your site, if you adequately address it, it never shows up on the website. It really doesn't. You have to dig pretty deep to find it. But NIDPO letters are when there was a Form 483 and the investigator gave them a really lame answer and didn't resolve the problems. Then it really gets addressed in a NIDPO kind of situation. Adequate assurances list, again, an FDA site. Clinical investigation inspection list, recent inspections and findings. And this takes a little more work to get to. NIDPOs are easy to find. These will take a little bit of time. But if, for example, if you had a Form 483, they found one deficiency, your site addressed it, and the FDA considered it to be resolved, and it doesn't rise to the level of a NIDPO letter, you will still be able to find it here. And the Bioresearch Monitoring Information System is a place where the Form 1571 and 1572s are submitted. Now, on this, it's sort of like, almost like a little database. The investigators, the CROs, and the IRBs that are listed on the Forms 1571 and 1572, and it just has the names and addresses. There's a little bit of a shortcoming here. The sponsors get the Forms 1571 for devices, and for us in drug development 1572, and they get assigned 1572 from every investigator. Now, this information system is based on the forms that are voluntarily submitted to the FDA. So it's not an exhaustive list. So some sponsors won't submit any. So this is a very voluntary process. They're not required by the code to submit anything. So it's a hit and miss system, but it's at least an opportunity to go and look and see what investigators have done other studies, maybe. So let's talk about sponsor documentation, because you know if you didn't document it, you didn't do it. 21 CFR 31253C2, sponsors are also required to obtain a curriculum vitae or other statement of qualifications of the investigator showing the education, training, and experience that qualifies the investigator as an expert in the clinical investigation of the drug for the use under investigation. So the sponsors are going to want, a curriculum vitae is like a resume. It's that fancy word for resume if you want to get right down to it. And the sponsor will ask for one from every investigator. And for investigators, it's usually, where did you go to, undergraduate training, medical school, residency, board certifications, that kind of thing. And it will also include other research that this investigator has done. And the sponsors will accept this as proof positive that that investigator is appropriate to do the trial. Can an investigator rely on his curriculum vitae? Yes, and you also see CV. And that will sometimes be a little acronym people use instead of curriculum vitae. They'll use CV. So the sponsors will ask for the CV, and typically they will ask, not always, but commonly they will ask to have it signed by the investigator. And that just gives them, that's not required by anywhere, and this is usually just an internal thing at the sponsor, but it somehow makes them feel better. So a lot of times you'll be asked to sign it, and that's an easy thing to do. 21 CFR 312.23 goes on, right? Requires study protocols that are submitted to the IND application. So if you're part of an early, like a phase 1 or phase 2 study, phase 1 typically, the name and address and a statement of the qualification, CV or other statement of qualification of each investigator. That is unique for the IND application. The IND application, remember, goes to the FDA, and the FDA has a short period of time to deny it or by default approve it. And so sometimes you'll be asked, especially if you're a phase 1 researcher, coordinator, to include this information to the sponsor that can submit it with the IND. So here's a question that we should talk about. Are individuals who've been delegated responsibility by the PI, such as RNs, pharmacists, and for our conversation, clinical research coordinators, required to provide a summary or proof of their qualifications to perform delegated tasks? Because we know the PI is the leader, or ICH or CFR is the person who actually conducts, right? So do other people that are on the research team have to provide some type of summary or proof of qualifications if they're going to perform delegated tasks? Technically speaking, no, you don't have to do that. So SOQ, statement of qualifications, really only apply to the actual clinical investigator. However, study staff really should be prepared to provide a statement of qualification. So one of the things that you're going to do as you leave this program is you're going to have a resume. You're going to either update, modify, make your resume all nice and shiny and new, or develop a new resume for yourself. And you could use that as your starting point, as your statement of qualification. So every time you do a trial and you're involved in a study, you need to include that on your resume, because if you update it on an ongoing basis, it takes about 2 minutes every once in a while just to update it. So I'm telling you now to go ahead and do that, because you can use that as your statement of qualification. And you might have sponsors that ask for this. Are you required to give it to them? Absolutely no. But remember, you want to have a good relationship with your sponsors. So if they say, hey, we need the pharmacists and the research coordinators and maybe the phlebotomists, then you're going to say, yeah, I can do that, and here it is. Sponsors are required to select only investigators qualified by training and experience, as we said before. So the regulations then implicitly require that the site staff be qualified to perform their assigned duties. And as I said, sponsors often document the qualifications of site staff according to their own procedures and as part of their site selection process. So be prepared to do that. Are you required? No, but it's really smart. Here's another question. Can an individual be listed as a sub-investigator if he is a graduate from a foreign medical school but unlicensed in the U.S. and performing physical exams under the supervision of the PI? This is an interesting question, and this can come up anywhere in the U.S., but border states will find this to be the case. And you'll find maybe perhaps more unlicensed foreign-trained doctors in Texas and Arizona and California, places like that. And this is not an uncommon thing. Maybe is the answer here regarding the foreign license question. Regulation of medical practice falls under state jurisdiction. Remember, the FDA is just only about the drug development process. It's a federal law. State licensing agencies have the final word on the scope of practice for unlicensed foreign physicians. Now, signatures by licensed physician to indicate review of procedures done by the unlicensed physician does not compensate in any way for lack of authorization to perform the procedure. So, if your PI says to the unlicensed physician, I want you to perform a physical exam, oftentimes your PI will sign off on that. That does not indicate, okay, so your PI is going to sign off that that unlicensed person did a good job. And so that sort of in the medical and the nursing world is a level of oversight that is provided. So graduate nurses that don't have their license yet have everything that they've done signed off on by a registered nurse. So this way there's sort of some oversight that's provided. However, in the terms of clinical research, if you have this happen, you want to have that unlicensed physician put on the delegation of authority log. So you can say, yes, your PI has delegated this to him. I know that might be a little bit much to think about. This might come up for you sometime in the future as you work. Also here, FDA investigators who find the unauthorized personnel were performing essential study procedures would be obligated to report that finding to the state medical board. So your PI, and this is not going to be your cross to bear, but your PI is going to have to be very careful about what authority he delegates to the unlicensed person. And your PI will be smart enough to know that. Okay, another question. According to 21 CFR 312, are sponsors required to conduct investigator meetings? So investigator meetings are where for multi-center trials like phase 3 trials, very large phase 2 trials, get all of the investigators together in a sort of a central geographic area. So if you have 30 investigators across the country, right, the sponsor will bring them all together for maybe 2 days, usually a very nice setting, and go over the study with them. But are they required by law to do that is the question. No, they are not required by law to do that. However, investigator meetings are just sort of a smart way to sort of kill 30 birds with one stone. So instead of that investigator going, or the sponsor going to every investigative site and going on 30 different trips, they will pull everybody together for efficiency's sake. The sponsor is responsible for providing investigators with the information needed to conduct the study properly. The formal investigator meeting is one way of fulfilling this requirement. So it is smart, but it is the centralized meeting itself is not required by law. So like right here, it's not, the meeting per se is not a requirement, and it's just a method to fulfill regulatory obligations. Your sponsor could forego the meeting, assuming the sponsor has some mechanisms for ensuring that all investigators have the necessary information. As long as that is done, it doesn't matter how it's done. As long as it's done, then the sponsor has met their regulatory requirements. All right, here's the question that came up. An employee who worked at a clinical research site for 3 years, model employee, dependable, honest, hardworking, everybody loved this guy. Unfortunately, this employee became involved with illegal drugs, convicted of burglarizing a home, and has just finished serving 4 years in prison. He has asked for his job back as a coordinator conducting clinical research trials. Here's the question we had to consider. Are there any regulations that would prohibit the site from rehiring this employee and having him work on future clinical trials? And remember, this was not a question I was asking from a perspective of an HR person. Like, I'm really just like, can a person with a criminal record work as a coordinator? So, are there regulations that prohibit this site from rehiring this employee? No. There's nothing in the Code of Federal Regulations that would prohibit this individual from working in clinical research. So this is, remember, we're talking about 21 CFR, so this is a federal code of regulations, and there's nothing in the federal code that says this person can't do this. The decision to rehire this individual is a matter solely at the discretion of the employer. So lots of people have opinions about this, whether this is a good idea or not, but there would be nothing that would stop you legally, according to the law, from hiring this person. So this person might be hired back if it's his brother that owns the research site. You know, so there are lots of scenarios where I could see this happening. The research site, specifically the PI, must consider whether he'll be a competent employee. The PI will be held accountable for his performance. This is really important. The PI, again, going back to both this ICH E6 and 21 CFR 312, the PI is held responsible for everything that happens on the trial. So it's really the PI's call. Back to the same question, same guy that just served 4 years in prison. Another question. Assuming that the individual was rehired, remember I just gave you the example, it's his brother that owns the research site. So he's rehired and the site was selected for an FDA audit. Could the inspector cite the site for employing a felon? English is so tricky. Could the inspector basically submit a form 483 because the research site was employing a felon? And the answer to that is also no. There's no violation of the law. We already said that there's nothing in the law that prohibits him from being rehired. And so, since there is no violation of the law, the inspector could not include this observation on the Form 483, right? The Form 483 is only noting non-compliance with the regulations. The only way the inspector could be made aware of the situation is if either the site mentioned this fact in conversation or if the site authorized the agent to inspect HR files. So this really is none of the business of the agent. So the FDA inspector that's at the site, this is none of his business. Really, basically, all HR actions are considered a business mechanism. Business transactions have nothing to do with 21 CFR 312. So this really is none of the business of the inspector. And so they really should not even know that this happened. But I will tell you, people get nervous when they have FDA inspectors, and sometimes people will talk too much. So here's references if you want to go look at the warning letters and see what's out there. It is interesting. You can search by geographic area. I believe in the clinical investigations inspection search, if my memory is correct, you can look through things through the Dallas office if you're interested in finding what's happening geographically in this area. But anyway, I love your questions. Please let me know if anything wasn't clear or if you have more questions. Also, I try not to talk too fast, so let me know if I'm talking too fast. Anyway, I will talk to y'all soon. Take care.